Traditional logic is actually easier than the modern system because, again, the modern system is mathematical, and it's not what you use in an argument. Traditional logic is what you use in an argument. You don't argue in simples. You argue in real words and statements.
You're listening to Classical Etc., a show from the Memoria Press Podcast Network, where we offer an in-depth look at the philosophy, culture, and heart of the Memoria Press family. Now, here's your host, Shane Saxon.
Hello and welcome to this episode of the Memoria Press Podcast. Today I got a chance to sit down with Martin Cothran. Martin has been at Highlands Latin School and Memoria Press since the beginning. He's written a number of books and writes articles and is now the head of the Memoria College. And Martin and I talked about his journey into classical education and what he's learned in the process and how he's articulated what classical education is. It was a very enjoyable talk. Here's our conversation.
And I'm listening to The Searchers now, which was, of course, what the movie some people think was John Wayne's greatest performance.
And it's based on the book or the
yeah, it was based on the book, Alan LeMay, and I haven't. I'm just starting that one, so I got to, I'm trying to hit all my westerns, the Oxbow Incident, the real classic ones. So as well as some of the ones, like Louis L'Amour and just sort of your Max Brand, who was another pulp writer, like that.
Are you like hitting all the different genres, or like are you gonna do like sci-fi?
I've got western, sci-fi. Where I'm concentrating on the classics, H.G. Wells and people like that, and survival stories, sea tales. And I don't know what to, but I guess they're pioneer stories. But like Mountie fiction, there's a whole genre of Mountie fiction.
Like written by Canadians specifically? Or?
Well, mostly. I mean, and by writers, and I'm telling you, these guys were really good. James Oliver Curwood I'm gonna list like 4 or 5 of the greatest writers of boys and they're really for adults too. These of adventure books, Raphael Sabatini, C.S. Forrester, H. Rider Haggard. James Oliver Curwood is definitely one of them. I just discovered him recently, but man alive. I mean, he and all these guys, they're writing in the 20s. They lived some of this stuff. Jack London, who's one of them, really. Jack London, if you read his life, you can see why he can write the way he does. He knows what he's writing about. These guys knew what they were writing about. They spent time, and Rider or Haggard, he was a British junior administrator in South Africa. He knew the Zulus. It's great stuff.
So, Martin, the question I've been wanting to ask you for a long time is, what is classical education?
Classical education is the great books in the liberal arts.
I don't think a lot of people realize that you come across as though you've been classically educated your whole life, but a lot of it is self-taught, right? I mean, you taught yourself Latin, you taught yourself some Greek, you've read a lot of the classics in your adult life. I mean, what drew you to the classics initially?
Well, my education began when I read a Chesterton quotation for the umpteenth time. I was standing in a line in Isla Vista, California, Santa Barbara, where I was going to school at the University of California there, and I read another quote from Chesterton. I thought, who is this guy? And so I did whatever my banking business was and walked onto campus to the great library they have there, and looked in the card catalog. Some people won't remember those, and looked up G.K. Chesterton, and his books are on the 4th floor. I go up there. There's 3 or 4 shelves of Chesterton books, and I remember pulling one out that looked like it had an interesting title, Heretics. And I pulled it off the shelf and I opened it up and I read a paragraph and I thought, this is the guy I've always wanted to read. So really my introduction to just about anything literary and philosophical, and I was a philosophy student actually at the time, but was Chesterton. And it was following the links from Chesterton because he's such a literary writer. He makes references to all these great writers. So you just kind of it was a great entree into all of that.
Can you remember any of the themes or ideas that he particularly elucidated that you're like, that, trying to put your finger on it?
Well, and I don't know that it has anything specifically to do with classical education per se, but just his whole view of existence, his joy in existence, his attitude toward the world. That's what has affected me most from Chesterton, is just his attitude, that he's to this wonder at the world. And that I think infected me, and I think it's infected a lot of people, a good infection. And so I still read Chesterton. I was reading Chesterton last night again, after not having read him for a few months. I realized I missed him.
Yeah. What were you reading?
Ignatius Press has published his complete works. Now, they're not even finished yet. This has been going on for about 20 years. But they've reprinted his weekly columns from the Illustrated London News, where he had a weekly column from 1904, somewhere around in there, to 1936 when he passed away. And they're just about daily affairs, but it's sort of like Malcolm Muggeridge says. He had this ability to relate the current times to the eternal, and so even though he's writing about something you may not be interested in, he always has something that's interesting to say. And right now we're in 1916, which is the middle of World War I, and almost every column is on the Germans, but it's still interesting because he's relating it to the eternal.
So, you said that wasn't directly related to classical education, but it obviously vaulted you into classical education. So what were the connections?
Well, I think it was just becoming interested in literature and philosophy. And then, like a lot, you didn't think about classical education then. You just thought about literature and philosophy. That term classical education wasn't a buzzword like it is now. And so when Douglas Wilson came out with that book, Rediscovering the Lost Tools of Learning, with the Dorothy Sayers essay, like a lot of people who are in classical education, that sort of drew my attention to that particular idea. But then, people were using Dorothy Sayers' developmental taxonomy as the sum and substance of classical education. And from my reading from Chesterton and on, I realized, wait a minute, the older classical education was about the classics. The older education was about the great books.
Could you explain Dorothy Sayers' developmental?
Yeah, well, it's the many classical educators know this, but it's the whole idea that there are three stages of learning: the grammar stage, the logic stage, and the rhetoric stage. The grammar stage just being, the idea that children learn best at that age, and they like learning through memorization and drill and that sort of thing. And then in the analytic or logical stage, they're thinking analytically. They're wanting to contest. They're wanting to argue. And then in her way of doing it, rhetoric is a more creative stage where the imagination comes into play, which, I do have some disagreements on the specifics there. Children's imaginations are being formed when they're very young too, during the grammar stage. But it's a competent taxonomy, and it came out before Bloom's taxonomy of learning, which is a staple in education programs, where you have 7 stages, and his is just more complicated. But it came out several years before that, actually, and there's some good observations in there. But I think what the whole classical education movement has come to realize over the last 20, 30 years is what the older classical education was. And that is that emphasis on the great books and the great ideas, and then on the liberal arts. And so, that's one of the themes that I have resorted to many times over the last 20 years.
And when you say the word liberal arts, especially when I first got here, I was like, yeah, I got a liberal arts education. But then when you use the words, it doesn't always mean what I thought it meant.
Right. Well, the popular meaning of that right now, when you hear it in public discussions, it usually means something that it's not. It usually is referring to the humanities, to English. If you're an English major, you're a liberal arts major. If you're a history major or a journalism, you're a liberal arts major. That's not actually the traditional meaning of the liberal arts. And even I find myself using it both ways sometimes. But really, the traditional meaning of the liberal arts is the skills. When we when many of us have seen the expression arts and sciences on the side of some college building or something, that's really what education is. Art, the skills, the arts. That's what arts meant in ancient thought, really up until very recently. And then sciences, which are bodies of knowledge. Now, we think of the natural sciences when we think of the sciences, but there are other bodies of knowledge, right? There are the theological sciences and the moral sciences, the human sciences, which we refer to as the humanities. And so the liberal arts really are the arts of communication and mathematics. The term liberal arts in its modern use means precisely not mathematics, whereas in the traditional use, it meant precisely mathematics and language. It meant both those things. So the trivium, the classical trivium, the three language arts, traditional language arts, grammar, logic, and rhetoric, those are language-oriented, all of them, including logic, which there are mathematical forms of that now that people mistake, I think, for logic, which really are a form of math. And then arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. Astronomy is just the application of arithmetic, music is just the application of arithmetic, and astronomy is the application of geometry, but they're all mathematical. So it's language and math.
And so did that insight kind of also connect to your, if we could say your specialty, it seems like you have 100 specialties, but logic, that seemed to be something you really latched onto. Was that before or after you started to kind of understand this paradigm shift of traditional education? Well,
in another sense, that was another entree into classical education. My academic background's in philosophy, and so I think I took every logic course they offered at the University of California, and so I was working in public policy, and we decided to start a school at a nearby church. And so I worked with the pastor there, and we decided we wanted to do a classical program. That was in 1994, I believe. And we didn't have a Latin teacher, so I volunteered, even though I didn't know. I figured I could learn it, And logic, the logic class, and so I had that training, but I couldn't find any text out there that was good for high school students. You have these college texts that are really not well written and not well laid out. And plus they emphasized this modern symbolic logic. And I had gone back and had started reading Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas and realizing that the old tradition of logic was a language art, traditional logic. That's a language art. And so I started to teach that. Well, there wasn't very many good resources out there anymore because modern logic has dominated in schools since the early 20th century. And it was really aligned with some modern philosophical movements like logical positivism and this sort of thing, which I was not wild about. So I just decided I was going to have to write my own book, and so I did, and that's what is now Traditional Logic Books 1 and 2. And I developed that in a class of high school, really even middle and high schoolers. And so that was another thing that made me understand one part of what classical education was.
Do you find that students respond to the way that you articulate logic, or are students confused about?
No, I think traditional logic is actually easier than the modern system because, again, the modern system is mathematical, and it's not what you use in an argument. Traditional logic is what you use in an argument. You don't argue in symbols. You argue in real words and statements and propositions. And so I think students find it intuitively easier. And, by the time you're taking logic, you've already used it some already, whether you know it or not, when even arguing with your parents or something. But and so it's just taking something they know and showing them how it works. And so I think it's a lot easier.
Yeah, so it seems like at least a lot of your work to me has kind of revolved around Aristotle, who seems like kind of an intimidating figure to a lot of people, but you also, taught rhetoric. And in the early days, were you also toying with teaching classical composition, which, now we have that program. How did you access Aristotle, even though he was difficult, and what has that been for you?
I did it backwards. When you start reading Chesterton, you don't even have to. Well, what I did was read Chesterton's book on Thomas Aquinas, And because Chesterton's thought was really based on Thomas Aquinas, but Thomas Aquinas' thought was based largely, not completely, on Aristotle. And so when I say I went backwards, that's what I mean. I went from Chesterton to Aquinas and then to Aristotle, which is a weird way of doing it, but it worked fine. And I'm still a student very much in terms of Aristotle. There's a lot of his things I still haven't read. But I think that, when you do go back and you do start learning about the philosophical tradition and you see these two figures there, Plato and Aristotle, and they are both very similar in a lot of ways, but then there are differences in the way they approach things. Plato is very sort of top down, and Aristotle is sort of bottom up. And I wrote an article once saying, all people can be divided into Aristotelians and Platonists, and in the sense that's true. Some people are top-down thinkers, some people are bottom-up thinkers.
So after you started that school, how did you get connected with Mrs. Lowe, and what was that relationship like at first?
Well, there was a very controversial education reform program that was passed by our state legislature here in Kentucky, and it was the same kind of reform that you get every 25 years in this country, which is very progressivist. And it was, all modern reforms are progressive and pragmatical. They're about getting a job, that education is about getting a job, and that education is about developing a child rather than the classical purpose, which is forming an adult. And so we were both involved in the opposition to that. I became sort of the chief spokesman in the state against that program. It was a very intense public battle back in the early 90s. And Cheryl was sort of, in a way, the brainchild of the opposition. She wrote 4 articles. And I always say that everything I know about education is from those 4 articles that Cheryl wrote. And so we met and started commiserating on the opposition to this education reform program. And finally she said, Bill Bennett talks about this. His wife told him one time, you do things, you do education wholesale. You need to do it retail. We were doing it wholesale in this public debate, and then we decided to do it retail. Yeah. But actually, she started a school at that time. I was still working in public policy, and then so in 1998, she asked me to come on board and to help her develop the curriculum and to teach at her school, the school that eventually became Highlands Latin School, where we're sitting right now, and so the rest is history. We had 2 or 3 products. We had the Latin programs and we had the logic programs, and I remember we sent out a mailer to a list of classical schools, and I think we got 25% response, which is 5% response is normally huge in a mailer. We got like 25. People calling saying, "Where you been all our lives?" And ever since then, it's been really very successful. People have loved Memoria Press.
Can you remember anything that you learned from Mrs. Lowe over at the beginning, or even not at the beginning? Or can you identify? I know your guys' minds became melded in some ways as you did this.
Well, that's what I was going to say, was I don't remember what was her idea and what was my idea anymore. Well, and because it's funny, because I would stop by her desk, and up until she passed away, I'd stop by her desk and we would sit there and talk for a half an hour, 45 minutes, an hour. And by the time we were done, I'd just go back to my desk and write down the notes from our conversations, because there was fodder in there for 3 articles. So I really can't say. I mean, I don't know how to parse those differences out, because I learned so much from her.
What do you think were the things about classical education that you saw clicking with people who started to attend here? I mean, were there particular differences with what they were experiencing in other schools that attracted them to what you guys were building?
Well, for one thing, I think just the seriousness about teaching Latin. I mean, people want to dabble in Latin. People want to use Latin as a supplement in their program. And so I think the biggest difference was simply we took Latin seriously and we taught it so that you could read Latin. We didn't just teach, the etymological stuff and the derivatives. That's what a lot of people wanted to do. And we're saying, no, you got to learn this. You got to, in order to use Latin to form your mind, which it really does, you need to take Latin. You need to really learn it, not just dabble in it. You can't just dabble and, change your mind, the structure of your mind. You got to do it seriously. So that was really, I think, the chief thing. And then just, the best of the best in terms of the literature we used and that sort of thing. We have this incredible tradition, particularly of children's literature, and to pass this on to the next generation of children. I'd say those two things were the most important things in our minds.
Yeah. So we just have a couple more minutes. In this last, couple of years, I guess you've turned a little bit of a corner and you've switched your focus in classical education to educating educators, but on a high level. So you started Memoria College. Mm-hmm. What are the challenges with Memoria College that you're running into? How has this opened up your understanding of classical education as you're speaking to people who are highly educated and helping them take another step forward?
Well, I was thinking about this the other day. This is a true natural development out of what we have been doing, because so now we've helped a generation of homeschooling parents to teach their children, and I think probably half of our students now in our first year at Memoria College are former or current homeschooling mothers. So now we've created this monster, if you will, all these mothers who have empty nests, and they have been inspired by classical education, and they want the rest of the story, and we're giving them the rest of the story. They're actually reading Aristotle, they're reading Plato, they're reading Aquinas, they're reading Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, and they are absolutely loving it. I mean, really, the challenge is to grow the program as faster than we are, because the demand is exceeded our expectations, and I sit in a lot of the classes because we're just starting out. I'm making sure everything's going okay. And they are loving it. And I sit there, I want to just poke my head in, and I sit there listening for an hour because it's so interesting to the discussion going on and to the instructors we have who really know their stuff.
Yeah. Awesome. Hey, well, I've enjoyed talking with you. Let's do this again.
I think that would be a good idea.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Memoria Press Podcast. If you like what you heard and you would like to hear more, please consider subscribing to our YouTube channel, Spotify, Apple Music, or wherever else you get your podcasts. My name is Shane Saxon, and I'll see you next time.
You've been listening to the Memoria Press Podcast Network, providing a classical Christian perspective on the world of education.